Welcome to the Feminist Park podcast. I'm Kwame.
And I'm Leilani. It's great to be kicking off this journey with you all today.
Yeah, we're diving into work that's really closely tied to the vision behind the Feminist Park project.
Imagining these truly equitable public spaces, starting with the idea for an intersectional feminist park right here in Berlin.
Exactly. And this podcast, well, it's kind of an extension of that. We're going to be digging into the academic research that, supports and informs that kind of vision.
We'll be taking these dense, sometimes quite academic papers and really pulling out the core and insights.
And looking at them through specific lenses, things like environmental justice, intersectionality, anti-colonial thought, queer theory.
All the stuff that helps us think critically about space. We are diving into a stack of philosophy and legal theory today that really challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions we have about sexual relationships. And that's the simple, sort of self-evident concept of consent.
Right.
I mean, if you're like most people, you probably think consent is easy, right? It's just a yes or a no. It's a clear line in the sand.
And that intuition, according to Manon Garcia, is exactly where we go wrong. Our sources today, they really center on her work.
Okay.
Specifically, her critique that this whole modern concept of consent is, well, it's deeply inadequate for achieving what she calls good sex.
So we're not just talking about a legal checklist.
No, not at all. We are analyzing the profound power of consent to legitimize actions, even actions that are, deeply unjust.
And I think that's our mission for this deep dive, isn't it? To move past that simplistic legal framework and really try to establish the actual rigorous conditions needed for consent to be valid.
Exactly. Conditions that Garcia argues go far, far beyond just a verbal yes.
The book, The Joy of Consent, it really feels like a philosophical sledgehammer to how we normally understand this term.
It absolutely is. I mean, Garcia highlights this massive intellectual confusion that just plagues our contemporary Western discourse.
How so?
Well, we rely on sexual consent mostly as a legal tool, right? It's the boundary between what's permissible sex and what's assault.
Sure.
But when we treat it that way, we inherently confuse what is legally acceptable with what is morally good, or even what's truly pleasurable.
Okay, so there's the core problem she's identifying. The common idea that consent is just self-evident because it equals agreement is, and I think this is her quote, simplistic and wrong.
It's wrong because it completely overlooks the entire social, psychological, and structural context where that agreement is even happening.
And that, I guess, leads to the fundamental question we want you, the listener, to sort of grapple with today.
Yeah.
What happens when acceptance, pleasure, and good sex just don't line up?
Right. If the legal system says the sex was acceptable, why do we then just assume that acceptability must also mean the sex was good, or desired, or equitable? That conflation it's intellectually dangerous.
So let's try to nail down the central thesis that's really driving this whole critique. Garcia argues that in our societies, which are so focused on individual rights and formal processes, we're constantly confusing what's merely acceptable, so legally permissible, with what's truly good or pleasurable.
And this confusion, it shows up in three really destructive ways. We can call them the three reductions of consent. They're articulated pretty clearly by both her critics and her supporters.
Okay, so the first reduction. This one feels like the most common and maybe the most relatable, especially in, long-term relationships. It's reducing consent to mere acceptance.
Precisely. This happens all the time. I mean, think about the scenarios we've all been in, or at least heard about.
Yeah.
You might accept sex not because you actively desire it in that moment, but because you feel a kind of relational obligation.
Like a duty.
Exactly. Maybe you accept sex to satisfy your partner after they've had a long, exhausting day. Or maybe you're just tired and you want to get to sleep. Or even just to avoid a big discussion or a breakdown later.
I see. So that acceptance is driven by all these other factors: obligation, compromise, a desire for peace.
And that is miles away from full, autonomous, desired consent. Yet in most legal or even just relational frameworks, that acceptance is treated as if it's the same thing as consent.
That distinction is so crucial, isn't it? The difference between true consent and just reluctant acceptance. It speaks to reciprocity.
It does. You're accepting sex as a duty. You're not desiring it as a mutual project.
So what's the second reduction?
The second is confusing legitimate consent with good sex. Just because sex is legitimate, meaning it was consented to under legal terms, that doesn't mean it's morally or subjectively good.
We have this tendency to assume that if no law was broken, then no moral transgression occurred.
Exactly. But as we're going to see, the line between legality and morality is often drawn in very, very different places, especially when you bring power dynamics into the mix.
So if we only define bad sex as illegal sex, we're ignoring this huge landscape of sex that's maybe disappointing or painful or exploitative, but it was still, formally consented to.
And that leads to the third reduction. Assuming legitimate sex is automatically pleasurable. Sex that is acceptable or legitimate, because that formal yes was secured, is not necessarily pleasurable. It's not even necessarily desired by the person who gave the assent.
So the central critique here is that in public discourse, and even in our legal norms, we wrongly treat these three very different terms, acceptable, good, and pleasurable, as if they're synonyms.
Right. Consent becomes the single umbrella term that is somehow expected to solve for legality, morality, and quality, which it simply cannot do.
And this tension, this gap between the legal and moral definitions, it provides some really stark examples of Garcia's point.
It really does. Look at sex work in France, for instance. It's illegal to purchase sexual services.
Okay.
So if the law criminalizes the purchase, the act itself becomes legally non-consensual by definition, even if both parties are adults who negotiated and affirmed the transaction.
But the moral reality is much more complex.
Of course. Garcia points out that sex workers who genuinely choose that activity, who aren't victims of trafficking or coercion, they may morally consent to the sex they sell. They're operating within a totally different moral economy than the one the state recognizes.
So the law is interfering based on a moral principle, the idea that sex shouldn't be a commodity, and that principle overrides the individual's choice.
Right, and you can see the exact opposite historically, where morality was completely overridden by law. Just look at the concept of marital rape.
For decades, even centuries, it was considered legally impossible for a man to rape his wife.
The timeline on this is genuinely shocking. It was only during the 1970s through the 1990s that this changed across various Western countries, the US, France, Germany.
The 1990s, that's so recent.
It is. Until then, sex between spouses was deemed permissible, even if it was obtained through threats or violence or explicit refusal.
So in that context, sex was morally and subjectively non-consensual, but it was entirely lawful.
Yes. The simple fact of the marriage contract served as a kind of blanket, irrevocable consent.
Those dates are just a stark reminder that legality does not equal moral acceptance or even basic safety.
So when Garcia shifts the focus away from consent as just a legal tool for prosecuting bad sex, she's moving to a concept that lies at the very heart of a much larger moral and social problem.
And that problem is?
The problem of knowing how we ought to have sex. The intuition that consent is purely a legal term just drastically oversimplifies the profound moral questions that are all tangled up with sex and power.
That's a staggering gap. But to really understand why these conflicts keep coming up, we have to trace the philosophical roots of consent itself. Garcia argues that our modern discourse gets tangled up because it confuses two major philosophical traditions. That's the source of all our ambiguity. Let's unpack that.
Okay, so we start with the liberal tradition. This really forms the bedrock of modern Western law, and it's most famously articulated by John Stuart Mill.
And this tradition is pretty intuitive for us, right? Because it's all about individual rights and freedom.
Exactly. The core concept here is that consent is the primary manifestation of individual freedom and autonomy. It's all about self-determination and the sovereign right you have over your own body.
So what's the mechanism? How does it work for Mill?
It's exceptionally formalistic. It's very straightforward. Consent is the giver renouncing a right, for instance, renouncing the moral right to physical integrity.
Okay.
And if this renunciation is given, and here are the key words, freely, voluntarily, and without deception, then consent is sufficient for the action's legitimacy. That's it.
So it's basically a yes checkbox. If the state determines the checkbox was ticked without any obvious external duress, then the act is permissible.
Right. The state only steps in if the harm principle is violated, meaning if you harm someone who hasn't consented, or if the action leads to some clear, irreversible social harm.
But importantly, this is an incredibly individualistic way of looking at it.
Extremely. It treats intimate life solely as relations between two autonomous, self-contained individuals without consideration for the social structures that may inspire individuals to make the choices they do. It's totally blind to context.
So the liberal framework gives us this formal validity. It's easy to check, but it doesn't really speak to the quality of the interaction.
Precisely. Now, contrast that with the much older and frankly more demanding Kantian tradition. This one centers on human dignity and moral justification.
Kant's core concept, if I remember, insists that consent has to reflect our fundamental humanity and dignity.
Yes. We must always treat every rational being as an end in itself, never merely as a means.
That's a powerful shift.
Hmm.
This isn't just about a formal agreement anymore. It's about the substance and the moral intention behind the act.
Exactly. The Kantian criterion is much more demanding. Moral action rests on the autonomy of the will, and that means a will that acts freely, guided by reason and respect for human dignity.
So for sex to be, as Garcia puts it, not only permissible but also good, the consent has to meet these much higher conditions of respecting humanity.
You have to pay very specific and careful attention to the other to make sure that the expression of consent is even possible under these conditions and that the interaction is mutually dignifying.
So we have the quick, formal, rights-renouncing version from Mill, and then this demanding, dignity-respecting version from Kant. Where does Garcia say the modern confusion comes from?
The ambiguity arises because we're trying to have our cake and eat it too.
How so?
Modern discourse tries to grant consent the formal validity of Mill, meaning it should be easy to get, just a simple agreement or a checkbox. But at the same time, we demand that it possess the justificatory power of Kant.
Ah, I see. So we expect a simple yes to somehow guarantee that the action is morally good and respectful and dignifying.
Precisely. We want the efficiency of Mill, but we insist it carries the deep moral and existential weight of Kant. And that mixture, as I said, leads to enormous normative ambiguity in our public debates about sex, because everyone is arguing from a completely different philosophical standard.
And we see this clash most clearly when we start to test the absolute boundaries of that liberal individualistic framework.
Right. Particularly in cases where people go to extreme lengths to formalize consent, like in the BDSM subculture.
Practitioners in BDSM often use these detailed, sometimes even written, contracts to formalize that liberal idea of consent.
They're asserting that their practices are the ultimate manifestation of individual freedom, very much in the spirit of Mill. They're essentially saying if we both agree and we aren't harming anyone else, the state should just stay out of it.
So the contract is a deliberate effort to solve that million checklist problem.
It is. These agreements are often negotiated, drafted, sometimes even signed. They're meant to formalize consent and safety, ensuring the active choice of everyone involved.
And they incorporate strict safety elements, right? Like RACK or SSE.
Yes. Risk-aware consensual kink, or safe, sane, and consensual. The negotiation process can be incredibly rigorous, and it's all intended to demonstrate a clear, active choice and independence of will.
Yeah, and the whole rationale is that this process establishes the physical and moral safety of the participants, which legitimizes the practices within that liberal framework.
Crucially, it also attempts to separate the sexual scene where you have fictional power relations being enacted for pleasure from the outside world of brute social facts like patriarchy or economic inequality. It's trying to say, in this controlled space, the power dynamic is voluntary and it's for fun.
But the law, which is often driven by that underlying Kantian principle of human dignity, it often clashes directly with this liberal assertion.
It does. And we can see this tension outside of sex, too. Just think about the famous French dwarf-tossing case, Commune de Marsan-sur-Orge from 1995.
That's the case where the Conseil d'État banned the activity, even though the individual entertainer gave his genuine economic consent to be tossed.
Exactly. The court cited a violation of the dignity of the human person. Here was an adult making a rational economic choice, offering his physical person for a fee, but the state stepped in.
And their argument was that certain actions inherently degrade human dignity to such an extent that individual consent cannot legitimize them.
Right. This shows that for the law, human dignity can, and sometimes must, override individual consent. It establishes a really important non-liberal boundary.
And when we bring that same principle back to BDSM jurisprudence in Europe, the tension becomes crystal clear.
In the UK's Lasky case, the European Court of Human Rights initially ruled that certain BDSM practices were illegal.
What was the logic there?
The logic was that harm and dignity principles override consent, even if the acts were private and consensual. The court basically said that the state is entitled to regulate activities involving the infliction of physical harm, regardless of whether they happen in a sexual context. Consent just wasn't enough if it infringed on this expansive definition of dignity or the harm principle.
So the state was essentially saying, you cannot consent to this level of harm or degradation even if you want to. That sounds very Kantian.
It does. But then the ECHR later softened this hard line and started to prioritize sexual autonomy. In 2002, in a case called Pretty v. UK, the court affirmed that the ability to conduct one's life as one chooses includes pursuing activities perceived to be of a physically or morally harmful or dangerous nature for the individual concerned.
That sounds like a pretty significant win for the liberal ideal of personal choice.
It was. And this commitment to sexual autonomy was solidified in the KA and ADV Belgium case in 2005.
What did that one establish?
That ruling affirmed that, quote, criminal law cannot in principle intervene in the area of consensual sexual practices. It prioritized individual free will in the bedroom.
But there was a catch, right?
A huge one. It's critical to remember that the Belgian case ultimately failed for the appellants because the victim's explicit negotiated safe word, which was mercy, was ignored. So the court established the principle of sexual autonomy, but it still required demonstrable, active consent. The second that safe word was breached, consent completely evaporated.
What's fascinating here is that even when practitioners go to these extreme lengths to formalize consent, this legal history just shows the profound limitation of the liberal framework.
It really does. The liberal view sees sex purely as a relationship between autonomous individuals. It completely ignores how power relations and gender inequalities permeate intimate relationships.
It fails to acknowledge that our social position profoundly influences what we can want or refuse. It's just blind to the systemic backdrop.
And that failure is exactly why we need to change our lens. If the liberal framework is insufficient because it treats individuals in a social vacuum, we have to shift our focus to the structures they operate within.
And this brings us to Garcia's most radical material, how patriarchy fundamentally shapes the very ability to consent. And this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a little challenging for those of us who are used to more individualistic critiques. We have to turn to Foucault.
Yes. Foucault established that sex is not just personal, it is intrinsically political.
He rejects that simplistic idea of power as just unidirectional domination, like a king forbidding an action.
For Foucault, power is a relational field of forces. It's a web of interactions where everyone is exerting and being subjected to power all at the same time. And sexuality, in particular, is a political object that's managed by two primary mechanisms.
The first is biopower, which is about controlling populations, managing demographics, birth rates, public health, the workforce.
And the second is the dispositive of sexuality, which controls individuals.
The dispositive. How should we think about that?
You can think of it as the entire apparatus, all the institutions, the laws, the scientific discourses, the common knowledge that dictates how we categorize and talk about sex.
So Foucault is basically arguing that the structures dictating how we categorize and discuss sex are what fundamentally determine our understanding of our own selves.
Precisely. And this leads to his most crucial concept for consent, subjectivation. Power doesn't just suppress the subject, power constitutes the subject.
What does that mean exactly?
We feel like we are tied to a sexual identity that's determined by our desires. But those desires, Foucault argues, are themselves an effect of the power structures. They're not some inherent, natural, pre-social nature.
So this deeply complicates that million idea of a completely free will choosing its actions.
It really does. Take the category of the homosexual. Foucault observed that before the 19th century, certain acts were prosecuted, but they didn't determine a person's entire identity.
Right.
After the 19th century, suddenly our sexual practices were seen as signs of who we are, a type of person.
So the place we assume is outside of power, the place where free consent is supposedly born, is actually a product of the dispositive of sexuality. So if our very identity and our desires are structured and shaped by power, how can any choice we make, especially in sex, be entirely free?
And if Foucault questions the very nature of the desiring subject, then radical feminists like Catherine MacKinnon take this structural analysis to its most critical conclusion when it comes to gender.
MacKinnon's thesis is known for being, well, extreme, and for its profound influence and controversy.
It is. Since femininity is socially defined by submission, the structural opposition of dominance and submission is what defines gender difference. MacKinnon argues that women can consent to nothing but their submission.
Wait, if we accept that, aren't we essentially arguing that women have no sexual agency at all? How does Garcia use a claim like that without removing all autonomy from women?
That's the critical tension Garcia has to navigate. McKinnon's point is structural. Consent, in a patriarchal society, acts not as a tool for liberation, but as a mechanism to conceal gender injustice and reinforce male power.
So the system itself demands and rewards female submission.
Exactly. A woman is making a choice, but the choices are so tightly constrained by structural domination that the choice itself becomes almost meaningless.
It's merely an adaptive survival mechanism.
Yes, and this is where the French philosopher Nicole Claude Mathieu provides the necessary nuance. She helps us distinguish between a structural reality and a personal conscious decision.
Okay.
She draws a crucial philosophical distinction between obedience and consent.
What's the difference there?
For women, what often looks like consent is, in reality, merely assent or acceptance, what Mathieu would call obedience.
Okay.
Mathieu argues that women's submission often results from a process of rational adaptation. They are attempting the best possible adaptation to the circumstances they face, primarily to escape the real dangers and the psychic consequences of domination.
That makes it sound like survival logic, not free choice.
Mhm.
You're strategically submitting because the costs of resisting are just higher than the costs of temporary compliance.
Precisely. And this leads to what she calls an epistemic obstacle. The dominated often lack full awareness of the domination they are consenting to. They assent to certain actions without realizing they're participating in and perpetuating the social domination that applies to them as a group.
That's a really powerful point about awareness. Can you give a concrete example of that lack of awareness?
Mathieu uses the example of domestic labor. A woman who spares her husband all domestic work cannot, for that reason alone, be said to consent to male domination.
Right.
She only truly consents, in the full philosophical sense, if she is aware that she does this work because she is dominated, and if she shares the conviction that she is inferior and must serve him, and that full awareness of the structural injustice rarely ever obtains.
So the woman is acting rationally within her situation. She's trying to reduce immediate friction or harm, but she's not necessarily endorsing the patriarchal system itself.
That's the subtlety. Mathieu argues that when awareness of the domination is achieved, when the dominated subject finally grasps the structural injustice, they typically resist. Therefore, the very word consent, if we mean it to signify an autonomous, self-aware will, is often just inadequate in situations defined by deep-seated domination. We're confusing the act of yielding with the act of willing.
This discussion of submission as a rational psychological act in the face of these structural constraints it's one of the most intellectually compelling parts of Garcia's whole critique.
Yeah.
And it leads us directly into what's called the agency dilemma.
The agency dilemma, as described by Cater, it really captures that conflict between acknowledging the profound vulnerability and oppression of marginalized groups, while at the same time respecting their capacity to act and make choices.
It's a complex balancing act.
It is. We can't just dismiss every choice made under duress as invalid, or else we deny the agency of the oppressed.
We have to recognize that people can absolutely choose their situation and still be fundamentally disempowered. Garcia gives the example. A woman can desire to be treated as a sexual object.
Right. She can find pleasure or affirmation in that role, even if that desire is derived directly from social norms that objectify women. Her internal desire is real, but its root is structural oppression.
So we have to understand how oppression both hinders autonomy and, at the same time, shapes agency.
And the key mechanism for this shaping is Amartya Sen's concept of adaptive preferences. This concept helps explain how those real desires are formed under duress.
This is a concept that needs a full unpacking because it's so central to undermining that whole "if she said yes, she must have wanted it" argument.
It's not self-deception. Sen argues it is a rational act of prudential reasoning. Individuals adapt their preferences and their desires to the narrow range of options available to them to avoid the pain of wanting what is unattainable.
Let's ground that a bit. Sen uses the really powerful example of extremely poor women, often from rural India, who adapt their nutritional beliefs.
They internalize the belief that they have very limited nutritional needs compared to their husbands and children, because high-quality food is just unavailable to them anyway. They are making a rational psychological effort to avoid the frustration and pain of fruitless yearning for food they cannot access.
And when we apply that to submission, the insight is just devastating.
It is. A woman may appear subjectively happy in a submissive situation. She has adapted her preferences to the circumstances she faces, finding comfort or reward in conformity, even if that situation is objectively harmful for her, limiting her opportunities and her dignity.
So subjective well-being is a terrible metric for judging the justice of a social situation.
Awful. And if the dominated subject's desires are adapted to their oppression, then a yes that reflects that adapted desire is not a genuine expression of autonomy, even if it feels real to the person giving it.
And this framework also profoundly illuminates why communication so often fails, or why a woman's refusal is not heard in sexual scenarios.
Yes. We need to bring in the concept of epistemic injustice, which is articulated by philosophers like Miranda Fricker, Christy Dotson, and Jose Medina.
Epistemic injustice. That explains how social power structures basically obstruct the production and reception of knowledge, right?
Right. And Fricker identified the first key type, testimonial injustice. This happens where prejudice causes a speaker to be given less credibility.
We see this tragically often in sexual violence cases.
All the time. For instance, Black women's accounts of racism or sexual violence are routinely met with suspicion due to deep-seated biases that perceive them as inherently less reliable, often casting them as liars or paranoid.
And then there's the second type, hermeneutical injustice. This is more about systemic gaps in our collective understanding.
Yes. That stems from a societal gap in our collective interpretive resources, the lack of language or shared knowledge that we need to fully recognize and articulate our own experience of oppression.
A good example would be before the #MeToo movement. Many women experienced workplace harassment, but they lacked the mainstream vocabulary to define it clearly as a systemic power abuse rather than just a personal bad experience.
Exactly. And Christy Dotson added a third type, contributory injustice, which really deepens this structural critique.
What does that one involve?
This is defined as the refusal of privileged people, for instance, those who write academic theory or hold judicial power, to seek out knowledge from marginalized people. It actively perpetuates theory that just erases non-dominant experiences.
And this links directly to Medina's concept of active ignorance.
Right. Socially privileged people actively choosing not to know possibly unpleasant truths in order to maintain their comfort and their power.
So when we apply this whole constellation of injustices to sex and consent, what does it reveal about the simple yes or no?
Well, it explains precisely why victims of sexual violence are routinely disbelieved. Their claims are not received or given uptake by judicial institutions or trusted individuals. That's testimonial injustice. But it also explains why men can, often subconsciously or even consciously, actively choose to not hear women's refusal and women's desires generally. If you are structurally used to ignoring the voices and knowledge of the marginalized, it becomes very easy to assume they are incapable of expressing genuine desire or refusal.
And that allows men's sexual entitlement to just proceed unchecked.
The system rewards not knowing.
To bring all these structural and psychological analyses together, we really have to turn to Simone de Beauvoir. Garcia uses Beauvoir to provide the necessary framework for understanding female submission, not as some innate nature or biological destiny, but as a social destiny.
Beauvoir's core existentialist insight, adapted here, is profound. One is not born, but rather becomes a submissive woman. Femininity is fundamentally a situation. It's an economic, social, and political positioning that's defined by others, specifically men who are the self or the subject of society.
She argued that women are forced into the role of the other within a society structured by male interests. And this allows men to escape the difficulty of true mutual recognition.
Yes. Women become the ideal intermediary between nature that is foreign to man and the peer who is too identical to him.
And this creates a unique phenomenological experience rooted in the lived body.
The objectification of women's bodies is inscribed in the social structure itself. It preexists any specific interpersonal relationship. This isn't just about one man looking at one woman, it's about society having already determined the meaning of that body.
So when does this objectification really start?
Beauvoir argues that puberty is the starting point of the submission. That's when the girl's body transforms into flesh, an object of the male gaze, even before she can fully understand her own body as erotic or subjective.
So the woman is compelled to live in the first person as a subject, but inside a body that has already been constructed by men's gaze as an object. That's a perpetual conflict of identity.
And this structural destiny leads to the expected behavior of submission, which then becomes inseparable from women's defined eroticism. Submission is the expected socially endorsed path for female sexual expression.
And this is compounded by the existential pressure to flee freedom. Existentialism emphasizes that freedom is a potentiality that has to be actively exerted, and that process causes stress, anxiety, anguish.
Beauvoir shows that for women, the cost-benefit analysis often tilts overwhelmingly towards submission. Submission is an easy path that avoids the anguish and stress of authentically assumed existence.
Right.
Social norms provide measurable privileges and protection for those who ally with the superior caste men. You are accepted, you are protected, you are often financially stabilized.
And the cost of exercising freedom of being a truly autonomous subject is immense. Ostracism, economic vulnerability, being perceived as difficult or unfeminine.
It becomes a rational, strategic choice based on structural inequalities. So women's submission isn't necessarily pure bad faith, but a consent to one's destiny as it's been predetermined by social norms.
And this submission is what Garcia is arguing, that the liberal framework uses the simple yes to legitimize, without ever addressing the underlying structural costs.
Exactly.
Let's transition now to the immediate consequences of these structural issues for the legal and moral definition of sexual violence. Garcia provides a crucial corrective to the current affirmative consent movement, which often focuses solely on a formal, verbal yes.
She refutes the simplistic, though well-intentioned claim that rape is sex minus consent. Garcia argues that affirmative consent is not sufficient to distinguish permissible sex from rape.
And focusing only on a formal yes creates two major problems.
It does. First, if non-enthusiastic, nonverbal, or intoxicated sex is always defined as rape, it risks diminishing the seriousness of actual violence and coercion. Rape is sexual violence and coercion. Equating it with sex that is merely unenthusiastic but not coerced risks making rape seem less rare and less serious than the violence it entails.
And the second problem.
Second, focusing only on the formal presence of consent is downplaying the role of the agent of sexual violence and coercion. It puts the entire onus on the victim to express refusal clearly enough, rather than on the perpetrator's intent or coercive, entitled behavior.
It's asking, did she say no? Instead of asking, did he actively ensure enthusiastic participation?
Precisely, and this is where Garcia's scenarios are so powerful. She illustrates 7 scenarios involving 2 characters, Sam and JC. All of them result in Sam having sex she did not want, but where only one is traditionally considered coercion.
Let's look at that spectrum of coerced assent.
Okay. Scenario 1 is the obvious one. JC forces Sam to have sex. That's traditional legal coercion. But then consider the gray areas where the line of formal consent is just so blurred.
Like scenario 2, Sam pushes JC away, JC gets angry and yells, and Sam, feeling guilty or just fearing his escalating anger, she simply lets the sex happen. She didn't want it, but she assented to avoid confrontation.
Or scenario 3. JC harasses Sam repeatedly, badgering her for sex until Sam, exhausted and just prioritizing sleep or peace, lets him proceed. This is coercion via relentless emotional pressure.
And scenario 4 is the silent agreement. Sam doesn't want sex, but tells herself it's too late to refuse because she invited him over. And JC penetrates her without any suggestion of consent or refusal being verbalized. He takes her silence for consent, based on the context.
Then there's scenario 5. Sam doesn't want sex, but is afraid JC will react violently or simply abandon her if she pushes him away, so she lets him penetrate her, choosing submission over potential danger or emotional cost.
Now, the most critical scenarios, 6 and 7, are the ones that directly contradict that simple affirmative consent model. Because in these cases, Sam actually verbally accepts the offer of sex. She says yes.
Right, even though she doesn't want it. In scenario 6, she says yes because she feels she can't afford to refuse. Maybe because he's a nice guy who has been waiting, or she feels she owes him reciprocity for a date.
Tapping directly into that sense of relational duty and adaptive preferences.
Mm-hmm. And in scenario 7, she says yes, because she wants to maintain her reputation as a fearless seductress or sexually liberated woman. Or maybe she simply wants to avoid the awkwardness of disappointing someone she values socially.
And critically, in none of these scenarios did Sam actually want sex.
In scenarios 4 and 5, JC is clearly taking advantage of patriarchal norms and the fear that men's potential violence instills in women. And in 6 and 7, Sam verbalizes consent purely due to structural pressure and her reputation, a clear manifestation of adaptive preference and submission, not autonomous desire.
The conclusion is undeniable. Focusing only on affirmative consent, especially just a verbal yes, risks legitimizing all these unjust outcomes that are clearly rooted in structural power dynamics, relational fear, and adaptive behavior.
That simple yes becomes a permission slip for structural oppression.
So this analysis really demands that we fundamentally shift our conceptual framework for intimacy. Garcia urges us to move beyond the current discourse that views sex as a kind of battlefield.
The historical model of man as hunter, woman as prey, or even the modern view that women must passively consent while men actively pursue an act. It all reinforces this damaging idea that partners have fundamentally diverging, often conflictual interests.
It's always a win-lose situation.
The alternative is moving toward a model of sex as an erotic conversation. Sociologists Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan, they encourage us to think about a sexual project, the totality of reasons for having or not having sex.
Yeah, that includes pleasure, intimacy, status, comfort.
And avoidance. This provides a much richer framework than just consent or no consent. It allows for continuous negotiation, adjustment, and mutual care.
And the ultimate goal that Garcia proposes, building on Beauvoir, is consent as respect.
This model requires a profound shift in behavior. It demands constant attention to the other, a high degree of reciprocal recognition, and a reciprocal generosity of body and soul.
And this is the key to achieving truly egalitarian and free intimacy. Moving beyond the selfish, inauthentic sexuality Beauvoir described as often afflicting men in a patriarchal system.
The goal isn't just not to rape. The goal is to create authentic pleasure through mutual respect.
So it requires challenging that puritanical reflex that insists caring and explicit attention and politeness must somehow be absent from sex because they might ruin the spontaneity.
We need to normalize being polite, asking what partners want, checking in explicitly, and ensuring reciprocal recognition in a concrete and carnal form. This shifts the focus entirely. The goal is no longer just avoiding legal liability, but creating truly good sex where, in Beauvoir's words, joy is gratitude, pleasure is tenderness.
And this requires men in particular to systematically unlearn their privileges and resist the temptation to define women's desires through the lens of their own sexual entitlement.
Exactly.
So let's wrap this up and look at the larger implications for society and, well, for you, the listener. We've established that the definition of consent is not a neutral checklist.
Not at all. It is structured by violence, domination, and assent, the rational adaptation of the dominated subject, as philosophers like Mathieu, McKinnon, and Beauvoir illustrate.
So if law and society continue to rely on a purely formal, liberal concept of consent, a checkbox that is quick and easy to obtain, that intentionally ignores the deep-seated reality of adaptive preferences, structural coercion, and epistemic injustice, are we truly protecting sexual autonomy?
Or, as Garcia provocatively asks, are we merely legitimizing the unjust vision of seduction relationships we already have?
A vision where the burden is always on the dominated subject to object clearly, rather than on the dominant subject to ensure genuine, uncoerced desire.
So the ultimate challenge for you, the listener, is to consider, what would genuine good sex require, morally and socially, beyond the simple structural yes?
If we are all subjects whose desires are fundamentally shaped by power structures, then achieving authentic autonomous consent requires profound social change and critical self-awareness.
It's not just a verbal confirmation at the bedroom door.
We have to ask ourselves if we are engaging in a conversation of reciprocal generosity, or if we're simply seeking formal legitimacy for an act rooted in convenience or structural expectation.
And if it's the latter, the simple yes is not liberating. It is merely authorizing the status quo.
And that's something to mull over. This knowledge is a tool, really. A tool for seeing your city differently, and potentially for helping to change it.
It's been a really insightful deep dive, I think. This document provides such a vital framework, especially for projects like the Feminist Park Project that are trying to build something fundamentally different. It shows just how interlinked urban design and social justice are.
It really does. But it also shows the scale of the challenge, right? It requires sustained effort, real commitment, and a genuine willingness to shift power dynamics in how cities get made and managed.
Definitely. It makes you think about how we ensure those voices, the ones that have been excluded, are actually heard and centered.
There's another quote from Sarah Ahmed that feels relevant here.
Go on.
She says, "If you have to shout to be heard, you are heard as shouting."
That's powerful.
It makes you ponder, doesn't it? How can the design of public space itself work differently? How can it amplify the voices of those who've been historically silenced, ensuring their needs are met without them having to shout just to be noticed?
How can design itself listen? That's a really provocative thought to end on.
A lot to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.